While slave traders roamed the streets and human lives were sold like property, there was one man who started a war against it all. His name was Thomas Smallwood, a shoemaker, a self-taught scholar, and a man who named the Underground Railroad. Alongside a white abolitionist, he freed hundreds, not quietly, but defiantly, daunting the very man who held the whips. I sat down with author and journalist Scott Shane to uncover the story that was buried for nearly 2 centuries. This is Flee North. Before we get into the interview, if you're watching this, you probably love history. So I recommend you to download my free 100 list of history books that will change your life. It's completely free, links in the description.
I was a journalist for 40 years, and most of that time I was working in Baltimore, where I live. And when we had moved to Baltimore in the early 80s, something called Harbor Place had opened. It was sort of what they call a festival marketplace. There were shops and restaurants and boats, and it was a really fun place to go when our kids were little and buy ice cream and see the boats. And so I had very pleasant associations with Baltimore's Inner Harbor. But then in the 90s, I found an old book that revealed to me for the first time something shocking, which was that for much of the 19th century, for most of the 19th century, slave traders had operated right around that same harbor, selling people in the domestic slave trade, the U.S. slave trade, after Congress had banned the African trade, and you could no longer kidnap people in Africa to become your workers. There was a labor surplus in the upper South, in the upper part of the slave South, and that was around Baltimore, Washington, and a huge demand for slave labor in the deep South, where the cotton plantations were booming. And so there was a domestic slave trade that arose that shipped people from the area around Baltimore to the area around New Orleans. Many people went by sea to New Orleans, were taken by sea, and then sold into the cotton and sugar plantations in the deep South. So it's a horrible story and a huge part of the crime of slavery, but something I was, like most Americans to this day, almost unaware of. And something like 1 million people were forced south in that way, and in most cases, families were separated. So wives were shipped away from husbands, and children were shipped away from parents. And in most cases, those separations were forever. With some difficulty, convinced my bosses at the Baltimore Sun, the newspaper I was working for, to allow me to write about this thing that had happened much more than a century earlier. And eventually, they agreed, and I wrote a long story in 1999 about this phenomenon. I went on to work for the New York Times for 15 years, but I never lost interest in that topic, both because it was an extremely compelling story, and also because I continued to find that very few Americans knew anything about it. I would ask my New York Times colleagues at times, I would surprise them and say, what was the domestic slave trade? And not a single person had any idea what I was talking about. And so when I retired from the New York Times at the end of 2019, I started looking for a nonfiction story to tell in that world of the domestic slave trade. But I found that virtually everybody sold south was illiterate at the time, and therefore there were very few first-person accounts of having been sold. And the slave traders themselves were sort of sleazy characters who were not terribly literary and were somewhat ashamed of what they were doing. So they didn't leave, full memoirs of their life and their work in the slave trade either. So I was a little stuck, and eventually I sort of broadened my area of research and came across first a guy named Charles Torrey, who was a young guy from Boston who had come from the North, very passionate anti-slavery guy. And I read a little bit about him, and because it turned out he eventually died in the Maryland penitentiary, where he had been sentenced for helping people escape slavery. So his story was quite compelling. But as I read about Charles Torrey, there were some accounts that referred to that guy. Torrey was white, and there were some accounts that referred to a guy who sounded like a black sidekick to Charles Torrey named Thomas Smallwood. And so I started looking into Thomas Smallwood and very quickly realized that while Thomas Smallwood was almost unknown, certainly to the general public, even to the scholarly community, he was far from a sidekick to Charles Torrey. In fact, it was very much the other way around, that he was the core of this operation to organize mass escapes from slavery. And that Torrey, who was younger and who was from the North, so didn't really know the region, um, didn't know the people. Smallwood knew everybody in Washington, D.C. at the time. And so Smallwood was the key guy. So I started looking more and more into Smallwood. And then at some point, so I had learned there in a couple places where there were references to Smallwood having written for a newspaper. The newspaper was very obscure, so it had not been digitized. So I went to the Library of Congress and learned that the largest collection of this particular newspaper, a small abolitionist newspaper, anti-slavery newspaper in Albany, New York, was in the Boston Public Library. But this was the height of the pandemic. So when I contacted the Boston Public Library, they said, basically, we're closed down. Maybe you haven't heard, but there's a pandemic. So, contact us next year or the year after. And so it took a while, but eventually they found this stack of old newspapers in a warehouse, and they dug it out. And then after a lot more back and forth, they microfilmed it. They put it on microfilm. An old-fashioned technology, but I guess they have that's how they do it. So I went to when the Boston Public Library sort of half reopened, I went there and spent a long day downloading images of all the of this newspaper collection of newspapers. And then I started reading Thomas Smallwood's dispatches to this newspaper, which he'd written under a pseudonym for obvious reasons, which were written in a sort of satirical style and were about the escapes that he was organizing. And, and I very quickly realized that between his remarkable accomplishments as an activist, as a kind of operator, and his writing, his unique and quite extraordinary writing, that he was the center of this book. And then at some later point, as I was reading these dispatches, I can tell the story in greater detail, but basically I learned that he was responsible for giving the Underground Railroad its name, which was a sort of historical mystery that no one had ever solved. That just sort of reinforced my notion that this guy is really should be considered to be a member of the pantheon of the heroes of American history. And yet he was a guy who was basically, all but disappeared. There were a couple of scholars who paid a little bit of attention to him, but mostly as a sort of helper to Charles Torrey. But there were entire books written, good books, written over the years about, for example, black abolitionists, other books written about the Underground Railroad that made no mention of Thomas Smallwood. So anyway, that's how, the long version of how this book came about.
It's very sad to hear that someone like that can just be forgotten by history. So I'm
Yeah.
very good that you wrote a book about like really focusing on his life and like figuring it out. What did he do? I think a good place to start is like to really understand his motives is maybe start from like the beginning of what did his childhood look like
Mhm.
and how did he eventually become the person that, well, we don't necessarily remember, we kind of forgot about him, but the person that you write about.
Yeah. So he was born into slavery in 1801, and he was born in a place called Bladensburg, Maryland, which is right outside Washington, D.C. One of the great missing pieces of his story, and this is very common when you write about the enslaved, because it is somewhere between very difficult and impossible to reconstruct the early years, even of people who become quite famous, unless they describe their early years in a memoir. Now, Thomas Smallwood later wrote a short memoir, but it's 60 or 70 pages long, and he devotes something like 5 paragraphs to his life in slavery, which was the first 30 years of his life. So, if I'm ever given the chance to speak with Thomas Smallwood, I will um, object to that and suggest that he write another 500 pages. But anyway, he does not mention, for example, in this memoir, who his parents were. I have no idea about his family background. I speculate that the fact that he doesn't mention his parents may suggest that they were separated from him at a very early age, which was very common in slavery. Whether they were sold to a neighboring farm or they were sold, 1,000 miles to the south, that was not unusual, and that might explain why he doesn't say anything about them. But you know, I've worked since the book came out. I've worked some more on that question, and I've gotten a friendly genealogist to work on it, and we still haven't come up with anything. Anyway, um,
Do we know where his grave is, by the way? Just
his
like,
grave, yes,
yeah, to
yes.
like figure out maybe DNA.
Well, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought about that. We'll get to his grave because that's sort of a story in itself. But the his early years are a bit of a blank. However, one thing happened during his early years, actually when he was 13 years old, that undoubtedly made a huge impression. And I think this is beyond speculation. It's pretty much certain because Bladensburg, where he lived, was a tiny place. And basically, the only thing that ever happened in Bladensburg was something called the Battle of Bladensburg. And this was in what we call the War of 1812. And the British were attacking the United States. And it was in 1814. The War of 1812 went on for a couple of years. And in 1814, the British famously successfully invaded Washington, D.C., and burned the White House and the Capitol. So they really made their mark. But they got into Washington by kind of blowing through Bladensburg. And there was something called the Battle of Bladensburg, where the Americans apparently did not fight very well and didn't put up much of a fight. I looked into this and I thought, well, here's a battle being fought in your little town. Obviously, Thomas Smallwood would have been aware of this. But as I looked into it a little more, I made a discovery that was quite striking. And that was that part of the British troops was something called the Corps of Marines. And the Corps of Marines consisted of formerly enslaved people who had been men who had been recruited by the Brits to fight for them in return for their freedom. So here's this enslaved boy of 13, and he would probably have seen that some of the enemy, from the point of view of from an American point of view, were black guys who looked like him and had been in slavery. And as the British troops moved around, it turned out that quite a few black men joined to fight, um, and would sort of stick with the Brits in order to achieve their freedom. But also, lots of black women and kids would join in, and so there were hundreds of black civilians following around the British troops, hoping this would lead to their freedom. So, I mean, it had to have quite an impact on this kid. I'm only speculating, but, here was the outside world breaking into his quiet little life, in a big way. Uh, and I just sort of wonder if this made him think about the larger horizons, ask some questions, wonder about, among other things, his loyalty to the United States of America, where he was not actually, as an enslaved man, he was not a citizen. And what is known, because Smallwood wrote about it, is that his enslaver, a man named John Ferguson, Ferguson's second wife, had inherited Thomas. He was owned technically, or inherited technically, by this woman and her children from a previous marriage. So a somewhat complicated situation. But John Ferguson was not a fan of slavery. He was maybe not what we would have called in those days an out-and-out abolitionist, but he didn't like the idea of owning a human being. So he went to Thomas at the age of 15 and said, "I will free you at the age of 30. I'm buying your freedom from my wife and her children for $500, and I want you to work and pay off the $500 between now and when you turn 30, and then you'll be free." And he actually went to the courthouse, the local courthouse, and filled out a paper when Thomas was 15, to sort of memorialize this and to confirm it in writing, probably because he didn't know if he'd be alive in 15 years. And there were often situations where someone was promised their freedom, and then the remaining relatives, the surviving relatives, had a different idea, and they wouldn't honor the agreement. So this kind of put it on the record and made it formal. So that's what happened. Is Thomas um, was hired out, which was a common practice, where his wages would have gone to this guy, John Ferguson, or much of his wages. In many cases, there was an arrangement where the enslaved person could keep part of the wage, and from that money, apparently, he saved up this $500 and paid off over time his freedom. Something else that happened in those years was that John Ferguson and his wife taught Thomas to read and write as a kid. And so he talks about impressing the neighbors, white and black, with the fact that he could spell words of 2 syllables. So, which was quite unusual. The vast majority of the enslaved were illiterate, and kept that way deliberately. So that made him stand out. May also have kind of encouraged his ambitions and his thought about himself as a special person. And another thing that happened probably when he was in his 20s, maybe upper teens and 20s, was he spent several years working as a household servant in the house of another white guy in Washington, D.C., named John McLeod. Uh, and McLeod was an educator, and he did not apparently allow Thomas to attend classes in the schools that he ran. However, he did, according to Smallwood, um, strongly encourage him in his learning, as did this guy's adult children. I guess they all lived together. And so the adult children and this guy, John McLeod, were constantly giving Smallwood books to read and encouraging him and guiding him in his self-education. And the result of all of this, was that by the age of 30, when he attained his freedom as planned, he was extremely well educated, even though he had never gone to school for a day in his life. He seems to have read everything. He was very interested in history and philosophy and literature, and and he seems to have had a voracious appetite for learning and a great memory for what he learned. So he seems to have educated himself to a sort of graduate school level without ever going to school. Um, one of the one of the many remarkable things about this guy. So so he's at the age of 30 taken a strong interest in something called the colonization movement. And colonization was it originated with the idea that the United States is never going to give black people a fair break, a decent life. So black people might as well strike out, find another country, and live beyond the bounds of the system of slavery. Although most of this involved free black people, people who'd either never been enslaved or had somehow attained their freedom. So he got very interested in this, and most of it then, as the movement grew, it sort of centered on the new Republic of Liberia in West Africa, which had been founded by the American Colonization Society. And many, thousands of Black Americans, most of them free, but some enslaved people who were offered their freedom if they would go to Liberia, they began to settle this new colony in Western Africa. Smallwood had two close friends who joined the movement and moved to Liberia and would occasionally come back for visits. And he seemed to be headed in that direction himself. But about the time he attained his freedom, uh, his views changed. And this was a common shift in public opinion among Black people at the time about this movement. And part of it was due to some very persuasive writers. But basically what Smallwood and others discovered is that the powers behind the American Colonization Society were not as maybe they had imagined, anti-slavery types or abolitionists. They were instead major slaveholders. And the idea that they had for colonization was to ship any free blacks back to Africa or to Africa because they feared that a growing free black population in the United States would undermine the institution of slavery. So Smallwood felt he'd been deceived and misled, and that the real purpose of this movement was to make, to sort of uphold and make permanent the institution of slavery. So he broke with this movement and denounced it to all his friends in the Black community in Washington, D.C. I should say that by now, both Smallwood, sometime when he was a teenager, both Smallwood and his enslaver moved to Washington, D.C. And they were living down near the Anacostia River in Washington, near what was called and still is called the Navy Yard, a huge U.S. Navy installation on the river. And so he was sometimes called Smallwood of the Yard, and he was supporting himself by working as a shoemaker. And he had married a free woman from Virginia named Elizabeth Anderson, and they had, at the time my story begins, they had 4 kids and a 5th one on the way. So they had a pretty big family. He's working as a shoemaker, but his sort of political interests were also very pronounced, and they focused on the institution of slavery, not surprisingly, for somebody with his background. However, now he realized or had persuaded himself that colonization was not the answer to this problem. So by the time he's 40, he's very well set up. His shoemaking business seems to be going very well. He has this large family. He's abandoned colonization, but he's still quite focused on the problem of slavery, the scourge of slavery. He wants to do something about it. And this is when the other character, Charles Torrey, shows up. So Torrey is from a very different background, about as different as can be imagined from Thomas Smallwood. He's from a different region, a region without slavery, from Boston, Massachusetts, in the North. Unlike Smallwood, who is completely self-educated, Torrey has been sent to Exeter, a fancy private school, and to Yale. So he's graduated from Yale University. And so he has sort of the best education, formal education, that one could obtain in the United States at that time. He's also about a dozen years younger. He's 28. And he's lived all his life in the North. After leaving Yale, he's tried his hand at teaching school, but it goes very badly. He accumulates, I think, 20 um, 20 students, but they dwindle to 5. He has no money. Apparently, the students do not think highly of him, and so he sort of flames out of teaching after a year or so. He decides to train as a preacher, as a minister, but and he does get a job in one church and then in a second church, but that doesn't go very well. I found somebody in one of his churches who describes him as giving a terrible sermon. So that doesn't go so well. But in the couple of years he spends as a clergyman, as a Protestant preacher, he's caught up in the anti-slavery movement, which was very common at that time where he was living in New England, in Massachusetts in particular. So um, he neglects, in fact, his work as a minister in order to work on anti-slavery causes, which is probably one reason why eventually he's essentially fired from his churches. And so he's doing well in the anti-slavery movement. He's giving lectures. He's uh, he's getting a bit of a reputation. He and and some allies try to take over the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in a very daring, what amounts to a coup attempt. They try to overthrow the best-known abolitionist in American history, white abolitionist, guy named William Lloyd Garrison, uh, but that fails. In the meantime, Torrey has married. He has a couple kids, and he has to support this family, so he kind of needs a job. And this anti-slavery lecturing isn't going to do the trick. So he decides to try yet another profession, something I did for 40 years myself, and that was journalism. So he goes around. It's not a bad idea he has. He goes around to a bunch of small abolitionist newspapers in the North, and he says, "I'll be your Washington correspondent, and I'll write about slavery and the anti-slavery movement, and for your paper, and send you these dispatches." And I think he talks maybe as many as 20 different papers, small papers, into accepting his content, and heads off to Washington, D.C. to do this, leaving his family behind with his wife's parents. So it's still, I'm sure his in-laws were not too sure about this, but he's very excited, in part because he's been denouncing slavery for several years now from afar, but he's never actually visited a slave state. And Maryland is the most northernmost slave state at the time. The borderline between Maryland and Pennsylvania is the boundary between the slave states and the free states. And so Washington, which is sandwiched in between Virginia, slave state of Virginia, and the slave state of Maryland, is also a place where many people are enslaved and where slave traders operate out in the open. You can't walk in those days from the White House to Congress without walking past the premises of Washington's largest slave dealer, slave trader. So he's very excited actually to sort of see the enemy up close. And what happens to him, Charles Torrey, when he arrives, is he's a brand new reporter. He's never done this before, but he spots what he thinks might be a great story. He learns that there's going to be a big convention of Maryland slaveholders in the capital of the state of Maryland, Annapolis, Maryland, which is not far from Washington, in January of 1842. And he's just been there a month, but he thinks this will be great. I'll go to this convention and listen to what these people have to say, and write it up for my newspapers. And so that's what he does. And however, things go awry because the first thing these slaveholders do is they throw the press out of the convention. And Charles Torrey, rather than give up this great idea he has, he sneaks up to the gallery in this in this meeting hall and decides he'll kind of hide in the gallery and be able to hear things and take notes. But somebody spots him in the gallery, and somebody else realizes that this is this young guy. In Washington and Maryland are not large places at the time, and so people have heard about this young Massachusetts abolitionist who's skulking around Washington. So somebody recognizes him as being an anti-slavery agitator, and so they throw him onto the street, and pretty soon, an a pro-slavery mob surrounds him, and they're basically discussing whether they want to tar and feather him or just outright lynch him. And a uh, a local magistrate, a local judge, comes along who realizes the situation is getting out of hand, and so he orders Torrey jailed, basically for his own protection. So Charles Torrey finds himself in the Annapolis, Maryland jail, where he spends a couple of days, and they can't think of anything to charge him with, so he's freed. But during those days, he's incarcerated with two black families who are experiencing something that was very common at the time, which is they are enslaved people who were property in the estate of someone who has died. And depending on how the court rules, they are very likely to be sold south, sold into the slave trade, cashed in effect, by the heirs of this estate. And in that process, they're very likely to be separated from one another. So he hears these families tell their story, and he's very struck by it. It's probably quite enlightening for him. And he is writing all this up. He writes this all up when he's free for his client newspapers in the North, and he makes it very much about him, um, and about how he has been, moved by the plight of these black families. And he writes about what he calls the vow that he made in the Annapolis jail, which is that he will, work tirelessly until this institution of slavery has been destroyed. And, it's very big words and very passionate, but he's sort of a 28-year-old nobody at the time. So they're pretty big words from somebody who doesn't have that much influence. Anyway, the next thing that happens is a momentous meeting from my point of view, but one that went unnoticed at the time. Uh, so Thomas Smallwood seems to read everything, including the local press. And the local press has written about this uh, guy, Charles Torrey, who's been arrested in Annapolis. And so Thomas Smallwood has read about this guy, and he also recognizes the name because his wife, Elizabeth, has a laundry business, and she happens to do the laundry for the boarding house where Charles Torrey is staying in Washington. Thomas really wants to meet this crazy young white man who came from the North and got himself arrested. So he asks his wife to set up a meeting, and she does. And so these two guys meet. And there is no account from either Torrey or Smallwood of this meeting. But it's interesting to think about the 40, at this point, 41, about to be 42-year-old black man, um, and this 28-year-old white man who get together and are meeting across, of course, first of all, the chasm of race at that time, and secondly, a bit of a gap in age, generation, uh, and finally, a huge gap in formal education. You have the Yale graduate meeting the man who's never gone even to grammar school, even to elementary school, and yet I would bet that if we had the two of them, if we could bring the two back to life from 1842 and give them a series of exams, that Smallwood would probably score higher in terms of his knowledge of of the major subjects of the day. But I think what they really have in common is they have both been talking about the institution of slavery for some years and arguing about it. And, you know, for Smallwood, that would be arguments about the colonization movement, which was a hot topic in the Black community in Washington, D.C., and in the much larger city of Baltimore, just to the north, where Smallwood and many people in Washington often visited. That was a big subject of debate. The debate went on and sort of was not resolved. Um, and meanwhile, Torrey had been up in the North arguing about the tactics of the abolition movement endlessly, having these internal fights which were quite vicious. Um, but there were fights among white people who, for the most part, had very little experience with slavery, just arguing about how they're going to topple the institution of slavery. So I think both of them may have been a little tired of talking, and they wanted to do something, and they both had this ferocious hatred of slavery. And so they come up with a very audacious scheme. And the scheme is to start organizing escapes from slavery in the region. And they don't want to do it by the ones and twos. They want to do it on a larger scale. So they decide they're going to buy or hire horse-drawn wagons, and they'll load all the people they can get into these wagons. They'll, throw a tarp over it or disguise it in some way, and they'll take off in the middle of the night for Pennsylvania. And so that's what they do. Starting in 1842, in early 1842, they start organizing these escapes. The key organizer is Smallwood, because he knows lots and lots of people who are enslaved in and around Washington, and some in Baltimore as well. And so he's the key guy in this extremely dangerous operation, which involves communicating with a bunch of people. They try to get 10, 15, 20 people into a wagon, which usually meant recruiting them from multiple enslaved households. So just logistically and communications wise, it was a very difficult thing to organize. Smallwood could not, put up a poster saying, "We're going to organize an escape on Saturday night. Please, call me at this number." Um, he could not text everybody and say, "Okay, we're ready to go." He had to meet with these people. He had to have some plausible reason he was meeting with these people. So perhaps he could approach them at church. Perhaps he could approach them at the market. Um, Perhaps they could pretend that they were talking about a new pair of boots he was going to make for somebody. But this was very difficult, and if it was also extremely dangerous. If they were surprised at the site of one of these gatherings, which is often at midnight or later in the middle of, in some desolate area of Washington or its outskirts. If somebody followed, for example, one of the enslaved people who was going to this meeting point, if the police got wind of it, um, you know, Smallwood could have been shot down at the site of the gathering. He could even have been, he could have been sentenced to a long prison term. He could even have been sold back into slavery as punishment for this. So the stakes were existential. The stakes were very high for him.
So, like, when he was communicating with the slaves, like, was it always a yes from the slaves? Like, they were interested in disappearing, or did he also have to, like, put a lot of work in just convincing the people? Because I can imagine it's super scary, and I
Yeah,
mean, you're used to the life.
that's a great question. Especially at the beginning, he definitely did some recruiting. He knew people, and he was literally approaching people and saying, "Have you ever thought about trying to escape?" And it was a daunting thing. Um, Even in Washington and Baltimore, he quickly recruited a guy named Jacob Gibbs, who was a black house painter in Baltimore, to be his sort of main man in Baltimore. And so Washington City at the time had something like 23,000 people, and Baltimore had more than 100,000. So Baltimore was actually the second largest city in the United States at the time after New York. So it was sort of the big city. And so having this guy, Jacob Gibbs, as his contact there, his sort of ally there, was very, very significant. He and I think eventually Jacob Gibbs were both recruiting people. But as the reputation spread in the, this was all secret, but, it was clear that the name of Smallwood began to spread in the community as somebody to see if you were interested in escaping. And in the white community, for quite a long time, uh, th- that remained mysterious. Nobody knew what he was up to. But so this started going in the summer of 1842 at a pretty good clip, so that every week or two or three, another wagon load was taking off. So the first night, uh, Smallwood later wrote, the first night they would make it basically to the Baltimore area, and they would only travel at night. So they would take off in the middle of the night. They'd make it to the Baltimore area, which today would be an hour's drive to the north. And they would hide out overnight. They would be hidden. During the day, they would be hidden, before dawn. And they would spend the day in hiding. And then the next night, very late in the next night, they would take off and they would reach the area of the Susquehanna River, which is a very broad, big river, which is the major sort of natural obstacle on the way north. And they would somehow Smallwood had recruited a guy who he only identifies as Mr. P, who had a boat and who was a sympathetic character and would organize what amounted to a secret ferry across the river and carry people across the river in the darkness on this boat. And so the third night, they would cross from Maryland into Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, they would connect with a group of Quakers. Pennsylvania was a big Quaker state, and the Quakers by then had sort of made anti-slavery part of their religion. And so they were sort of obligated to help people. And so they would connect with the Quakers. The Quakers would get them to the city of Philadelphia, where there was a large anti-slavery community. And from there, they would travel, for the most part, if Smallwood and Torrey had been able to raise the money for tickets, they would travel on trains and steamboats. And Smallwood always urged people to continue to travel until they reached Canada, which was part of the British Empire. The British Empire had abolished slavery in 1833. So you were crossing an international boundary into a country that had abolished slavery. And that's what Smallwood thought it would take to be safe. And so that's what he encouraged people to do. So you would think that Thomas Smallwood, who is still working as a shoemaker, supporting a large family, and spending every moment of free time organizing these escapes, spending his nights organizing escapes, sometimes driving the wagon, sometimes recruiting somebody to drive the wagon. You would think that he would have enough on his plate at that time. But I think it tells you something about what kind of guy this is, that he decides in the early summer of 1842, that this is not enough, that he also wants to write about these escapes. And so one of Charles Torrey's newspapers that he's sending off dispatches to is a small paper in Albany, New York called Tocsin of Liberty. Tocsin is an old word that means bell or alarm bell. So basically, this newspaper is called Liberty Bell or something like that. And so Smallwood makes contact with the editors and starts sending off newspaper articles, dispatches. These are really worth pausing on because they're very unusual. First of all, it's a rare example of published writing by an African American that early in American history. There aren't a lot of writers who managed to have their work published. Black writers have managed to have their work published at that time. The second thing is, I think these are, as far as I can tell, these are the only writings published in real time by an organizer of escapes from slavery. So they're unique in that sense. And third, their style is very unusual. For the most part, they're satirical in nature. They're sometimes scathing about the slaveholders. Sometimes they're quite hilarious, quite funny, because they're mocking the slaveholders. And the whole sort of purpose of these dispatches is to mock the slaveholders, mock the slave catchers, the people who are paid or collect rewards for catching escaped slaves, to mock the police who are basically in the pay of the slaveholders, and to celebrate the people who are escaping slavery. And they're written in a satirical style that owes a lot to Charles Dickens. And this is not accidental. Smallwood was a huge fan of Charles Dickens. Thomas Smallwood was a huge fan of Charles Dickens, as were millions of people, English speakers at the time, because Dickens. It was early in Dickens' career, but he had published his first novel, which became a global bestseller, called The Pickwick Papers. So one of the striking things about Thomas Smallwood's writings is they're both a work of literature and they're a work of journalism, because he uses the real names of the slaveholders and the people who are escaping from them. He tells true stories that he's heard from the enslaved people about what they've suffered from these slaveholders. So he's sort of exposing the misdeeds of the slaveholders and naming them. And so in that sense, it's sort of a work of journalism. But it's written in this style that owes a lot to Dickens. And while he uses the real names of the escaping slaves and the slaveholders, there's one person whose real name he can't use, and that's his own. So he borrows from Dickens the name of the most popular character in the Pickwick Papers, which is somebody named Samuel Weller. And so Sam Weller, the most popular character in the Pickwick Papers, is a servant who is distinguished by being much smarter than the people he worked for. And so I think Smallwood is playing with that to some degree, but he's using a name that anyone would have recognized, but is clearly not his own name. So he insists that the editors in Albany, New York, mail a copy of this obscure newspaper to every slaveholder who is named in his columns. And so you can just imagine these people down in Washington, Maryland, and Baltimore, who get a copy of this paper they probably have never heard of, and they open it up, and there they are exposed and mocked and ridiculed. And so, not surprisingly, both in Baltimore and Washington, groups of slaveholders get together and offer a big reward for the capture of whoever is behind these escapes. And so there is a great guessing game going on as to who this guy Sam Weller is, who's writing about these escapes and who's clearly part of the escapes. He knows all about them. And I think it's fair to say that while Smallwood is playing an extremely dangerous game by sort of poking the bear and calling attention to these escapes and essentially, you know, daring these people to try to figure out who he is. I think it's also fair to say that when people read these newspaper pieces, which are very literate, they sometimes make literary references and very stylish. Um, they're not, their first thought is not going to be um, a black shoemaker who never went to school. So they start thinking about other people, and they can't figure out who it is for a long time. And the thing that's so delicious about this situation is that Smallwood is, as he writes, lurking among the slaveholders, many of whom are his neighbors, and who know him and who he knows, and overhearing their conversations and reporting their conversations in his newspaper columns. And they're talking often about the escapes, which are a colossal economic blow to these people. And he reports some conversations in which some of these people say, "I'm done with slavery. I'm not going to buy another slave. It just doesn't work." They run off, and that's the end of it. So I'm going to hire people from now on, which of course is a wonderful thing for him to hear. So in the course of reading through these newspaper dispatches, the most gratifying discovery uh, was had to do with the phrase the Underground Railroad. Um, there were a couple of folklore explanations for where that term came from. Who had first, applied the term Underground Railroad to the escapes from slavery. But most scholars rejected these notions. They just didn't hold up to the slightest scrutiny. So generally speaking, historians did not know where this phrase had come from. So as I was reading through Smallwood's writings for the newspaper, I was very struck that the first couple of times he uses the term Underground Railroad, it appears to be a new formula. And the story is really an interesting one. So there was a somewhat notorious Baltimore police constable, a senior police officer. And this is in the early days of American policing. And this guy is not only a police constable, but also has his own private detective agency, and also makes most of his money, as did most of the police in Washington and Baltimore at the time, by running after escaped slaves, returning them to their owners, and collecting the very generous reward money. And so he's keenly aware of escapes from slavery. And apparently one day he is heard expressing his frustration at the proliferating number of escapes recently, and the fact that he cannot figure out how people are getting away in such large numbers. And for him, this is, sort of a significant part of his income. So it's on his mind. And he apparently says something like, "They must be getting away by underground railroad or steam balloon." And at the time there were railroads. Railroads were very big. They started in the very late 1820s. And now there was a rail connection between Washington and Baltimore. People rode it all the time. And so railroads were on people's minds, but there were no underground railroads yet. So the Underground Railroad was something that did not exist, and steam balloons were sort of an experimental technology. Essentially, what he's saying is, I don't know how these people are getting away. They must have been abducted by aliens, is what we would say. In other words, something we know to be untrue, um, um, but as an expression of bafflement. So someone who overhears this, sort of tantrum, I guess you'd call it, on the part of this police officer and slave catcher, reports it to Smallwood, and Smallwood puts it in one of his newspaper pieces. He often is addressing the slaveholders and sarcastically comforting them on the loss of their beloved servants. And And so he says, "Oh, maybe maybe your beloved servant escaped by Underground Railroad or steam balloon, as one of the police constables was swearing about the other day." And then he clearly realizes that this is a great compliment to him, to the people who are escaping. It's one more stick he can use to beat on the slaveholders. So he starts riffing on this phrase, the Underground Railroad, and using it. So he advises slaveholders who are puzzled by the disappearance of their human property to go to the office of the Underground Railroad in Washington, which of course does not exist, to inquire after their lost property. And he appoints himself at one point general agent of all the branches of the National Underground Railroad. So he makes this kind of imaginary bureaucracy almost out of it. And he has a grand time. So when I read all this, I wondered about, where's this coming from? And so I went into the big newspaper databases, that 19th century newspaper databases that of papers that had been digitized, which by now is a lot. They're quite big, rich newspaper databases from the 19th century. And I put in the phrase Underground Railroad, often written as 4 words at the time or 3 words, Underground Railroad or Underground Railroad. And sure enough, it turns out the Smallwood's columns, which were, even though that newspaper was not digitized in these big databases, his columns were sometimes reprinted in other papers. And so all the first references to the Underground Railroad, and in connection with escapes from slavery, come from Smallwood. And then Torrey, who has become the editor of this Albany newspaper, some months after this operation begins, he leaves Washington, and Smallwood's operating alone in charge of these escapes. But Torrey becomes the editor of this newspaper in Albany that's publishing Smallwood's columns. So he picks up the phrase Underground Railroad. He uses it at times, and only within a couple of years, you see the phrase being picked up by other newspapers, and soon it becomes sort of a common phrase to be used in describing escapes from slavery. So I pretty much proved that Thomas Smallwood is responsible for giving the Underground Railroad its name, and that was that was another thing that sort of solidified his importance in American history, I think, and just a great solution to a sort of literary mystery or linguistic mystery. So, this guy was really something.
Did Thomas ever get close to getting caught with these operations?
Well, he did. It's probably inevitable. I believe the rewards being offered for the capture of whoever was behind these escapes was something like $2,000 in Washington, 2,000 in Baltimore, and that would be today about $60,000 or $70,000. So there was probably close to $150,000 reward being offered in our dollars for the capture. And so it was a real motivator. And there was a particular new police unit in Washington. And the head of that police unit began to have his suspicions. So I don't want to give away the whole story, but basically, there came a time when things got very hot, and in fact, the police surrounded a barn where Torrey and Smallwood were working to um, load a wagon with I think at that point it was about 15 people uh, who were being loaded into water, and the police close in, and Torrey and Smallwood have to take off. And so the people they were trying to help are captured, and the whole thing's a disaster. And Smallwood then knows that he's a wanted man. He's had some indications that they were onto him, and he's quite worried about it. Um, and partly as a result, he's already sent his family to Canada, and his family is in Toronto. And so he takes off running, and his account of his escape um, is really, um, really quite dramatic, and I think is probably the most exciting part of the book that I wrote. So he ends up following essentially the same route he sent many people, other people on, even though he's free. And he settles in Toronto. And so I mentioned, you asked about his grave. So um, this is maybe the time to say that he lived for many years. He lived, so he was operating in the early 1840s. Um, he lived for another 40 years. He dies in Toronto in 1883 at the age of 82. So he lived a long life. He was buried in a cemetery called the Toronto Necropolis. When I went looking for his grave, I had uh, I knew what a fairly small section of this very large, beautiful cemetery in Toronto. It's kind of hilly, big trees, um, many, many gravestones. I knew what area he was buried in, but I looked and looked and looked and could not find any stone, and talked eventually to people who ran the graveyard and people who'd worked there, and they said that if he ever had a gravestone, which he probably did, it had long since sunk into the earth and was covered over by grass. The interesting thing from the point of view of race and economics and the driving forces in American history, there are three characters in my book, three major characters. Smallwood is the central one. Then there's Torrey, another good guy. And the third one is Hope Slatter, who was the leading slave trader, domestic slave trader of the day in the 1840s, who operated from Baltimore's Inner Harbor. And so it is perhaps a commentary on American history that Hope Slatter has a huge tomb in Mobile, Alabama, where he retired with the fortune he'd made from slave trading. And it's a huge kind of block of marble, the largest in this large cemetery, and it's surrounded by a gold-painted fence, and it's very elegant, elaborate, has sculptures and so on. Charles Torrey was buried in another famous old cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard is, and it is he has a very nice monument built by his fellow abolitionists, which has quotations from him, and it's maybe 8 feet high. It has a metal sculpture of him. It's surrounded by flowers. It's lovely in this beautiful old cemetery. Um, so maybe not quite as impressive as the slave traders monument, but very impressive. And Thomas Smallwood has nothing, nothing that remains above ground. So he was erased for the most part from history, and erased literally from Earth. So he may have a gravestone that's somewhere under the earth, and maybe someday someone will take an interest in trying to find it and dig it up. It appears to have become, it did become, a family graveyard. His wife was buried there. Some of his kids were buried there. There is no stone for any of them either. So this is maybe obscure history for non-American audience members, but something that was very poignant to me. I'll tell you. This is kind of a coda to the whole story. So Hope Slatter, the slave trader, I think it's fair to say, was a vile and criminal individual by any kind of moral standard. He was constantly separating families. He was selling children as young as 6 or 7 years old away from their mothers. And he had a son, Hope Slatter Jr. And I followed these families a little bit, you know. So Hope Slatter Jr. uh, has an interesting story that reflects the post-slavery history of the United States. He is basically a ne'er-do-well, a kind of libertine. You know, he seems to devote his life as a young man to um, wine, women, and gunplay, and eventually he kills someone in a drunken brawl, and he's put on trial for murder. But his wealthy family somehow raises the money to pay a bribe to get him out of prison, and so and eventually he even wins a presidential pardon. And the way he wins a presidential pardon is by testifying about corruption in the prosecutor's office in Washington, D.C., where this all happens. And the corruption is the bribe that was paid to get him out of prison.
What the hell? That's such an American story.
Yes. So so you'd think his reputation might not be that great. First of all, he's a murderer. Second of all, he's a bribe payer. But about 10 years after he's freed from prison, he becomes the police chief in Mobile, Alabama, in the city of Mobile, Alabama, where his father had retired. Uh, and so we're apparently a very forgiving country in those days, especially for white boys with a lot of money. So 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 he becomes the police chief, this murderer. Um, and it was interesting to contrast his fate to one of Thomas Smallwood's sons. One of Thomas Smallwood's sons, William Smallwood, after the Civil War, he's apparently been a really spectacular student. He's attended, probably on scholarship, the most prominent school in sort of a private academy in Toronto at the time. And then he goes to law school and he becomes a lawyer. And after the Civil War, he moves to the southern state of Mississippi, and he's practicing in Jackson, Mississippi, um, where even though he's a black man, he's hired by the city of Jackson to do various kinds of jobs for the city, legal jobs for the city, and apparently has quite a reputation as a lawyer. However, he dies in his early 40s, and I don't know what of, probably some disease. There is an obituary in the local paper that praises him as a prominent prominent colored lawyer. Anyway, he seems to have done great work and had quite a reputation, but he dies young. And the really tragic part is that by the time of his death, um, the um, the period after uh, the Civil War, when in the South, the federal government, the government in Washington, essentially began to enforce the rights of black citizens. And so there were black people being elected to the House and Senate in Washington. There were many black officials being elected on the power of the black vote in these heavily black states in the South, including Mississippi. All that had been reversed. Lincoln was assassinated. The guy who succeeded him began to undo all of that. The black vote was being blocked. The ability of black people to vote was being blocked and would stay blocked for almost a century until the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So this guy, William Smallwood, died as the world that he was part of was beginning to crumble as white supremacy took hold again in the American South. Um, and it would have, and certainly the slave, the son of the slave dealer, slave trader, Hope Slatter Jr., the murderer, he would have been very, very much part of the new order as police chief in Mobile, Alabama. So, the aftermath of this story is quite tragic.
Yeah, that's sad to see, and probably also for him himself, like the son, probably seeing kind of like the work undone that his father maybe did.
Yeah, and one of the sad, facts about Thomas Smallwood, he and his wife had 5 children, and they all died before he died. So which was not unusual, of course, in the 19th century. Particularly in the South, there were disease epidemics every year, but even in the North, and so he buried all 5 of his children before he himself passed. His legacy, is very significant, both as an activist and a writer, and something that I hope to do. I hope my book does, and I hope others pick it up. But I hope that he will eventually get the attention that he deserves. I'd very much like to see a memorial of some kind to him in Washington, D.C., where he worked. And I will continue to work on that.
Yeah, I think it's very important that these type of figures in history don't get forgotten. And you did an amazing job with your book, and I think everyone should read it. Like, if you want more details in the story, like the link will be in the description.